September 15, 1916, 6:20 a.m. The Somme, France. Through the pre-dawn mist crawling across no man's land, Gefreiter Hans Müller pressed his face against the clay wall of his trench. 23 years old, Bavarian Infantry Regiment 16. 3 months on the Western Front. He'd survived artillery barrages that turned men to mist. He'd watched friends drown in mud-filled shell craters. He'd fired his Gewehr 98 until the barrel burned his hands. But he'd never heard this sound before. A low, mechanical rumbling, growing louder. Müller glanced at Unteroffizier Schmidt beside him. Schmidt was 41, a veteran of colonial campaigns in Africa. His hands never shook. They were shaking now. "Was ist das?" Müller whispered. Schmidt didn't answer, his eyes fixed on something emerging from the smoke and fog. At first, Müller thought it was a building, a metal shed somehow moving across the cratered earth. Then the shape clarified. Rhomboidal, massive, 26 feet long, 8 feet tall, covered and riveted armored plates. Caterpillar tracks wrapped entirely around its body, grinding over barbed wire that had stopped every British infantry assault for months. 2 barrel-like protrusions jutted from its sides, sponsons, though Müller had no word for them. Inside those sponsons, 6-pounder guns swiveled toward his trench. The British Mark I tank. Müller's training evaporated. He raised his rifle, fired. The bullet sparked off armor plating and ricocheted into darkness. He fired again. The tank didn't slow. Machine gun fire erupted from his left, MG-08s that had mowed down British infantry by the thousands. The bullets pinged harmlessly against the tank's armor. 12 millimeters of steel plate laughed at 7.92 millimeter rounds. The tank kept coming. Müller watched it roll over German barbed wire defenses, obstacles that had taken weeks to construct, that had created killing fields measured in yards of corpse-strewn earth. The wire tangled in the tracks briefly, then snapped like thread. Teufel! Someone breathed behind him. Devil. The Mark I reached the forward trench. For a moment, Müller thought it would stop. It didn't. The rhomboidal shape tilted forward, tracks biting into the trench lip. 8 feet wide, exactly the width the British designers had calculated would span a German trench. The tank's nose dipped into the trench, then rose on the far side. The entire vehicle crossed over, crushing the trench wall, burying sandbags and wooden supports. Inside that tank, 8 British crewmen were cooking alive. The 105-horsepower Daimler engine generated temperatures exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit inside the crew compartment. Carbon monoxide from the engine mixed with cordite smoke from the guns. The noise, tracks grinding, engine roaring, sponson guns firing, made communication impossible without shouting directly into a crewman's ear. But Müller knew none of this. He only saw an invincible monster. Along the German line, panic spread faster than the tanks themselves. Of the 50 Mark I tanks the British had brought to the Somme, only 31 made it to the start line. The rest, victims of mechanical breakdowns before battle even began. But 31 was enough. German soldiers fired everything they had. Rifles, machine guns, hand grenades that bounced off armor without effect. In some sectors, men simply ran. Müller stayed. He'd been taught discipline. He reloaded his rifle with trembling fingers and fired again. The bullet struck the track assembly, did nothing. The Mark I pivoted, its sponson guns now aimed directly at his position. He dropped below the trench lip as the 6-pounder fired. The explosion showered him with dirt and shattered wood. His ears rang. When he looked up, Schmidt was gone. Just gone. A crater where the Unteroffizier had been standing. 2 more tanks appeared through the smoke. Then another. Müller pressed himself against the trench wall. His rational mind tried to process what he was seeing. Some kind of armored automobile. But automobiles had wheels, and these had tracks like agricultural tractors. Armored tractors. Mobile fortresses? His vocabulary had no category for this weapon. Behind the tanks, British infantry advanced in waves. They walked upright across no man's land, something unthinkable without the tanks leading. The tanks had cleared paths through the wire, crushed machine gun nests, created chaos in the German defensive system. Müller heard screaming from his right, then silence, then more screaming from farther down the trench line. A British soldier appeared above him, bayonet fixed, eyes wild with adrenaline. Müller raised his hands. The battle for this sector was over. By day's end, conflicting reports flooded German command posts. Officers tried to make sense of the chaos. Soldiers described what they'd seen, but their accounts varied wildly. X-shaped, one report stated. Square-shaped, claimed another. Powered forward by shovels. Can hold up to 40 infantrymen. A soldier from Field Artillery Regiment No. 13 wrote, an armored automobile, curiously X-shaped. None of the descriptions were accurate, but accuracy was impossible when fear and confusion dominated perception. Only a few German units actually engaged the tanks directly that day. The rest heard rumors, third-hand accounts, stories that grew more terrifying with each retelling. Huge chaos spread through the German army. Officers demanded information. What were these machines? How many did the British have? What powered them? How could they be stopped? Prisoner interviews provided one consistent detail. German soldiers regarded the tanks with some sort of superstitious terror. But that terror wasn't universal. In quiet corners of German headquarters, staff officers were already calculating. The tanks were slow, walking pace at best. They broke down frequently. They were conspicuous targets. Many had ditched in shell craters or caught fire. Of the 31 tanks that began the attack, only 9 actually reached German lines and engaged in sustained combat. The rest broke down, ditched, or were abandoned by crews suffering from heat exhaustion and carbon monoxide poisoning. The British had unveiled their secret weapon prematurely, some German commanders argued. They'd revealed the concept without having enough machines or training to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Countermeasures could be developed. On October 21, 1916, just 36 days after the first tank attack, Army Group Crown Prince Ruprecht issued the first official German anti-tank doctrine, How to Combat Enemy Tanks. The report was methodical. Dig anti-tank ditches. Concentrate artillery fire using 77mm field guns in close range. Create bundle charges from hand grenades tied together. Stay calm. The tanks were machines, not supernatural beings. But in the trenches, fear remained, because whatever these machines were called, tanks, landships, armored automobiles, they'd done something no weapon had accomplished since 1914. They'd crossed no man's land. The Mark I proved something the General Staff believed impossible. A machine could cross no man's land. But the Western Front demanded more than proof of concept. It demanded evolution. By late 1916, the British had produced only 50 Mark I tanks. Mechanical failures had rendered 30% of them useless before combat. Of those that actually fought, crews suffered casualties from carbon monoxide poisoning more often than from enemy fire.
The tanks were slow, so slow that German artillery could track them and aim deliberately, rather than rely on sweeping fire. The Germans, meanwhile, moved with methodical precision. On October 21, 1916, Army Group Crown Prince Rupprecht issued its anti-tank directive, How to Combat Enemy Tanks. The report was calm, rational, devoid of panic. Yes, the British had unveiled a new weapon. Yes, German soldiers had been shocked by its appearance, but shock faded when replaced by doctrine.
Dig anti-tank ditches 6 feet wide and 8 feet deep. Space them at intervals along the front. Tanks cannot jump chasms. Use concentrated artillery fire at close range. 77mm field guns could penetrate armor at sufficient velocity if crews remained calm and trained. Create bundle charges. Hand grenades bundled together, thrown or detonated by sappers with demolition expertise. The tanks had no protection against explosives placed directly beneath them. Most critically, maintain discipline. The tanks were machines, not supernatural beings. They broke down. They caught fire. Their crews died like other men. But by mid-1917, the British unveiled an answer to the German countermeasures. The Mark IV appeared in May 1917. It looks superficially identical to the Mark I, still rhomboidal, still 45 tons. But internally, almost everything had changed. The frontal armor thickness increased from 6 to 12 millimeters to a uniform 12 millimeters. The German armor-piercing K-bullets introduced in 1917 were designed to penetrate 12mm plate at close range, but required perpendicular impact angles the Mark IV sloped surfaces deliberately prevented. The new armor was, in practical terms, impervious to German anti-tank measures developed for the Mark I. The gun mounting system changed as well. The Mark I sponson guns created structural vulnerabilities, metal protrusions where armor joined to framework. The Mark IV sponsons were smaller, with reinforced mounting brackets that distributed recoil stress across the entire hull. Most critically, the 6-pounder guns were shortened. The Mark I's barrels had caught on German trenches, tilting the tank backward and immobilizing it. The new shorter barrels meant lower muzzle velocity, but greater practical accuracy in trench assault, where targets appeared at 20 to 40 yards distance. The fuel system relocated to the rear hull exterior. This wasn't innovation for its own sake. The Mark I's internal fuel tanks, positioned near engine components, created fire hazards when armor was penetrated. Crews had burned alive when German artillery found fuel tank locations. The new external placement meant crews could potentially abandon tank more rapidly if fire erupted. An unditching beam was carried on roof rails. The Mark I frequently ditched in shell craters, creating immobile targets. The new system allowed crews to rapidly position a beam beneath the hull, providing purchase for tracks to climb out of craters. The British manufactured 1,220 Mark IV tanks, 420 male variants with 6-pounders, 595 female variants with machine guns only, and 205 supply tanks carrying ammunition and supplies. The German army received reports of the new tank specifications in summer 1917. The improvements were noted, analyzed, and categorized as evolution rather than revolution. The Mark IV was more reliable, more heavily armored, and more tactically sophisticated, but it was still a tank, slow, visible, breakable. What the Germans didn't anticipate was the scale of the next assault. On November 20, 1917, the British launched the Battle of Cambrai with 432 to 476 tanks operating en masse. It was the largest tank attack in history to that date. The German front, disrupted by the sheer number of armored vehicles advancing across a narrow frontage, fractured. For the first time, tanks had achieved decisive tactical breakthrough. The ringing of bells in London, unauthorized, spontaneous, celebrated an Allied victory that newspapers across Britain proclaimed as proof that the Western Front's stalemate was ending. But Cambrai was deceptive. The breakthrough couldn't be exploited because the cavalry reserves intended to pour through the gap never arrived in sufficient numbers. German counterattacks, launched within 72 hours, recovered most of the lost ground. Still, something fundamental had shifted. The tank had proven it was more than a novelty. Combined with artillery, infantry, and reserves, it could break German entrenchments. But there was a problem that neither side yet fully understood. The Mark I and Mark IV shared a critical vulnerability. They required constant innovation just to remain viable. German anti-tank methods adapted rapidly. Within months of the Mark I's debut, anti-tank rifle ammunition had evolved. Anti-tank gun designs progressed from theory to prototype. Shaped charge explosives, anti-tank mines capable of penetrating even Mark IV armor were in development by 1918. The British technological advantage was real but temporary. By 1918, the Germans would deploy their own tanks, the A7V, designed specifically to counter British armor. It would prove mechanically unreliable and difficult to manufacture, but its 57mm gun could penetrate even Mark IV plate at effective combat distances. The arms race was accelerating. And in Berlin, the General Staff was calculating production numbers, manpower requirements, and the one resource Germany lacked above all others in 1918: time. In Berlin, Colonel, later General Ernst Volkheim, studied the Cambrai battle reports with mechanical precision. 58 tanks had broken through German lines. German counterattacks had forced the British back. The battle was, tactically, a German victory despite the initial breakthrough. But Volkheim was not concerned with tactics. He was concerned with inevitability. The British had proven that concentrated tank forces could break trenches. The question was not whether tanks could be stopped. Every weapon could be stopped. The question was whether Germany could develop and manufacture effective counters before Britain deployed overwhelming numbers. The mathematics were grim. Germany was already short of raw materials, manpower, and industrial capacity. Britain had access to American production. The United States had entered the war in April 1917. American factories could produce tanks, ammunition, aircraft, and ships in quantities that made German production statistics look like cottage craftsmanship. Still, Volkheim moved forward with methodical German thoroughness. The first German anti-tank measures were crude but effective. Bundle charges, several stick grenades bound together, could destroy a tank's tracks if pioneers could approach closely enough. The tactic required infantry to suppress supporting machine gunners first, but it worked. Disabled tanks could then be finished with flamethrowers or artillery. Anti-tank ditches were dug across likely tank approaches, 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep. Tanks moved at walking pace. Crossing such obstacles was impossible. German engineers became experts at recognizing terrain favorable to tanks and preparing defenses accordingly. Artillery received new training. The 77mm field gun, Germany's primary artillery piece, could destroy a tank with a direct hit using standard high-explosive shells, but direct hits were difficult when tanks moved across broken terrain. Gun crews learned to aim for tracks, cripple the tank, and it became an immobile target. Artillery observation posts were sited to provide forward visibility of approaching tank formations. By mid-1917, armor-piercing ammunition arrived. The Spitzgeschoss mit Kern, bullet with corn, featured a hardened steel penetrator wrapped in softer jacket material. It could penetrate Mark I armor reliably at close range, though the Mark IV's 12mm plating proved more resistant.
But the most significant development arrived in early 1917, the anti-tank gun. The 3.7-centimeter TAK tank Abwehrkanone was rushed to the front line on a light mobile carriage. It was small, easily concealed, and could be rapidly deployed in threatened sectors. At effective combat range, 300 to 500 meters, its solid-shot ammunition could penetrate tank armor despite armor improvements the British introduced with the Mark IV. Germany manufactured these guns in limited numbers. Production capacity was stretched between artillery, rifles, machine guns, and other weapons. Only elite anti-tank detachments received them. In early 1918, two new weapons were in final development stages: the Mauser Tankgewehr and the more ambitious TÜV machine gun. The Tankgewehr was a scaled-up single-shot rifle firing 13.2 millimeter armor-piercing rounds. The TÜV was a belt-fed machine gun using the same ammunition, the first dedicated anti-tank machine gun concept. Both would have been formidable weapons, had they entered service in quantity. They arrived too late.
Meanwhile, the British were developing their own next-generation tank. The Mark V appeared in 1918, revolutionary in ways German intelligence only partially understood. It retained the rhomboidal hull of its predecessors, but internally it was fundamentally different. The Mark V used a new transmission system based on epicyclic gears. Earlier tanks required 4 crew members to control movement, one steering each track, while 2 others managed engine throttle and clutch. The Mark V required 1 operator pulling simple steering levers. This reduced crew from 8 to occasionally fewer, lowered fatigue during long operations, and improved response to tactical commands.
The engine produced 150 horsepower, a significant improvement over the Mark I and Mark IV's 105 horsepower. Speed increased to 4.6 miles per hour. Range extended to 45 miles. The improvement meant tanks could operate farther from supply depots and maintain higher speeds during pursuit operations, critical for exploitation of breakthrough. Armor reached 14 millimeters on the front, with 12 millimeters everywhere else. The curves and slope angles were optimized to resist German anti-tank gun shells. The British built 400 Mark V tanks, 200 males armed with 6-pounder guns, and 200 females with machine guns. But the Mark V wasn't the final evolution. The Mark V Star appeared in 1918, extended by 6 feet to cross German trenches up to 11-12 feet wide. It weighed 33 tons, carried up to 14 additional infantrymen inside, and required only slight modifications to existing Mark V design. The British manufactured these machines in significant numbers, though exact figures remained classified. German intelligence tracked these developments with increasing alarm. By spring 1918, Berlin understood that the technological advantage Germany had maintained through rapid countermeasure development was eroding. The Mark V and Mark V Star represented a qualitative leap that existing German anti-tank systems, even the new Tankgewehr and TAK, would struggle against. But there was still one possibility. Germany could deploy its own tank. The Sturmpanzerwagen A7V entered production in 1918. It was massive, 33 tons, more heavily armored than any Allied tank, and armed with a 57mm gun capable of penetrating British armor at effective ranges. It represented German engineering at its finest: over-engineered, over-heavy, mechanically complicated. Only 20 were manufactured before the war ended. 20 tanks in a continental war where the British and French combined possessed hundreds. By summer 1918, the mathematics had become impossible. Germany faced an Allied coalition with overwhelming industrial capacity, access to American production, and now, with the Mark V and Mark V Star in service, tanks that represented the latest evolution of a weapon Germany had underestimated for 2 years. The General Staff knew the answer to the tank problem. There was no answer. Not anymore. Oberbefehlhaber West, Supreme Command West, issued new operational orders in March 1918. The German army, bloodied for 4 years of attritional warfare, was launching its final offensive. Operation Michael would break the Western Front and force Britain to negotiate peace before American industrial might achieved full mobilization. It was Germany's last throw of the dice. The German offensive achieved tactical surprise and initial breakthrough, but the Allies held. By May, the operation had failed. Germany had expended its last reserves of manpower and materiel. Now the question was no longer offensive capability, it was defensive survival. The Hindenburg Line was Germany's answer. Built during winter 1916-1917 under the direction of Field Marshal Hindenburg and Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff, the fortifications stretched 90 miles across northern France, from Arras to La Faux near Soissons. 12,000 German laborers, 3,000 Belgian workers, and 50,000 Russian prisoners of war had constructed the system. The work was methodical, merciless, and comprehensive. 2 main trench lines ran parallel, approximately 200 yards apart. Each was reinforced with extensive underground dugouts, some extending 20 feet below ground level, carved into chalk and limestone, designed to shelter entire companies during artillery bombardment. Barbed wire entanglements stretched up to 100 yards deep in zigzag patterns. Concrete machine gun emplacements, observation posts, and ammunition storage bunkers were sited for interlocking fields of fire. The defense-in-depth system extended 6,000 to 8,000 yards from the main line. If the forward trenches fell, defenders could fall back to intermediate positions and inflict casualties on pursuers. If those positions collapsed, the rear defenses remained. German commanders called it impregnable. But by summer 1918, German commanders understood something about the word impregnable that 21st century hindsight would only confirm. It meant nothing against hundreds of tanks. In July 1918, German intelligence began reporting British tank concentrations around Amiens. The numbers were staggering, hundreds of tanks being marshaled for an offensive. New tanks appeared in reconnaissance reports, the Mark V with improved armor and speed, the Mark V Star, lengthened to cross wider trenches. German General Erich Ludendorff received the assessments with grim awareness. He understood mathematics. He'd studied American production capacity. The reports were classified, but their conclusions clear. The United States was producing thousands of tanks annually supplied to British and French forces. Britain's own production accelerated. France manufactured tanks as well. Germany possessed 20 A-7V tanks. 20! In a continental war, 20 tanks was a battalion of armor. Impressive for a single sector. Irrelevant strategically. The anti-tank measures developed over 2 years of warfare would have to suffice. Across the Hindenburg Line, German engineers worked through summer preparing kill zones. Artillery positions were sited in hidden locations where 77mm guns could emerge from cover and fire on Allied tanks. The emphasis was on suppressing observation posts, the forward observers who called in artillery fire on German positions. If German artillery could identify and destroy Allied observation posts, tanks would advance blind, unable to coordinate with supporting artillery. Anti-tank obstacles, deepened shell craters, widened anti-tank ditches were prepared on likely approaches. 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep, spaced at intervals that prevented tanks from jumping the gaps. German engineers calculated that even the Mark V Star's improved suspension couldn't cross such obstacles. Pioneer detachments were trained in bundled charge tactics, gathering stick grenades into tightly bound Geballte-Laden charges that could be thrown or detonated under disabled tanks. The tactic required courage. Infantry had to suppress a tank's supporting machine gunners, close on the vehicle, and place explosives while exposed to point-blank fire. The Tankgewehr, the new anti-tank rifle, arrived in limited numbers. 13 millimeters in bore diameter, firing armor-piercing ammunition, it could penetrate tank armor at effective ranges. But it was single-shot, manually loaded, exhaustingly heavy, and suffered from mechanical fouling after 2 or 3 rounds. It required a trained marksman, and surviving to take accurate shots at tanks proved difficult. The 3.7-centimeter TOC, the anti-tank gun that Volkheim had championed, arrived too slowly and in too few numbers. Some pioneer detachments received 2 or 3 guns, others received none. Production couldn't meet demand when German industry was stretched to breaking. By August 1918, the preparations were complete. The Hindenburg line bristled with weapons, obstacles, and prepared defenses. Every commander, from platoon leader to army group commander, understood what was coming. The British would attack, and they would bring hundreds of tanks. German soldiers stared at the horizon in those late summer days, smoking cigarettes they couldn't afford to waste and thinking about things they couldn't afford to contemplate. Many had fought since 1914. If they'd survived that long, they'd watched weapons systems cycle through generations. They'd mocked the first tanks. Now they waited for the machines to come. August 8, 1918, 4:20 a.m., the Amiens salient. Hauptmann Karl Richter stood in a forward observation post, binoculars hanging from his neck, and listened to the strange silence before dawn. He'd held this position for 3 weeks, elevated ground overlooking no man's land toward the Chipili Spur. The machine guns of his company, dug in along the ridge, had good fields of fire. He didn't hear the creeping barrage at first. It was the new British technique. No preliminary bombardment to announce an offensive. No ranging shots to establish accurate fire. Instead, fire began precisely at 4:20 a.m., moving forward in coordinated waves, timed to infantry advance. The German artillery, 504 guns, identified by British sound-ranging technology and aerial photographs, was already being hit. Richter heard the groans of wounded men from the artillery positions to his rear. Then he heard the tanks. The sound was different from 1916, louder, closer, multiple engines running in coordination, hundreds of tracks grinding forward simultaneously. Through the pre-dawn mist they appeared. Not the occasional machines of 1916 or the concentrated battalions of 1917. This was overwhelming force. 462 Mark V tanks and 96 medium-A Whippets advancing across a 15-mile front, supported by over 2,000 artillery pieces and 1,900 aircraft. The Mark V tanks moved at 4.6 miles per hour, faster than men could run, but slow enough to keep pace with supporting infantry. The Whippets, thinner-skinned but armed with machine guns, moved at 8.2 miles per hour, capable of exploitation if breakthroughs developed. Australian infantry followed immediately behind the tanks, moving into the creeping barrage that had promised death to the first men to cross no man's land in every previous attack. But this time, the barrage preceded the infantry, lifted ahead of them, and created a protective dome of shell fire. German machine gunners emerging from dugouts to man their weapons found only artillery fire greeting them. Richter watched Mark V tanks cross his forward positions as if the trenches were merely topographical features. The 14mm frontal armor ignored his machine gun fire at close range. German anti-tank guns, sighted in concealed positions, fired. Direct hits, multiple impacts, and the tanks kept coming. One Mark V took a direct hit from a 77mm field gun. The armor was penetrated. The tank slowed, smoke pouring from an engine hatch. For a moment, Richter thought it might stop. It didn't. The tank kept moving forward, trailing smoke, until it cleared the immediate area and disappeared into the German rear. Pioneer detachments, trained in bundled charge tactics, tried to close on disabled tanks. German soldiers had worked through summer perfecting the technique. Suppress supporting infantry with concentrated machine gun fire. Close on the vehicle under artillery cover. Place geballte Ladung charges beneath the hull. Detonate. It worked once.
A Mark V disabled by artillery fire was destroyed by German sappers using bundled charges. There were 461 other tanks. By mid-morning, the Germans understood the scale of what they faced. The Australian and Canadian Corps, supported by the British Third Corps, had broken through the front along a 12-mile sector. German reserves, committed to stop the advance, encountered tanks they weren't prepared to counter. Up to 30,000 German soldiers surrendered on the first day alone. They laid down their weapons, raised their hands, and walked backward into captivity with the expressions of men for whom the war had become incomprehensible. Some reported having put up minimal resistance. The will to continue fighting was simply gone. By the third day of the battle, August 10th, German reserves had been committed and the initial breakthrough had slowed. Fresh opposition appeared on the battlefield, but the tank losses were telling. Of over 500 machines that began the attack on August 8th, only 85 remained combat-capable on August 10th. Not from German anti-tank measures, from mechanical breakdown, crew exhaustion, and combat attrition. The Mark V was superior to anything Germany possessed, but it was still a machine. Tracks broke down, engines overheated, clutches burned out. Crews suffered from carbon monoxide poisoning worse than in earlier tanks. The more powerful engine of the Mark V produced more fumes in the same confined space. But the Germans couldn't exploit these mechanical limitations. Even with 85 tanks reduced from 500, the remaining machines were enough to maintain Allied momentum. General Erich Ludendorff, observing reports from the Amiens sector, understood the mathematics of August 8, 1918. He perhaps had 40 A-7V tanks, his only tank reserve. The British could deploy hundreds. The French had thousands of Renault tanks, less formidable than Mark V's, but still overwhelming in quantity. The ratio of force was approximately 10-1 against German armor. Ludendorff called August 8th the Black Day of the German army. He later stated that on that day he realized Germany had lost the war. But the battles weren't finished. The real test of the Hindenburg Line was still to come. After Amiens, the Allies understood something the Germans had understood in different ways since 1914. Momentum was everything. General Edmund Allenby of the British Expeditionary Force and General Ferdinand Foch of the French Army coordinated the next phase of operations. They would attack not at the strongest German positions, but at multiple points along the front simultaneously. Each attack would be supported by available tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The Germans wouldn't have reserves enough to counter at every breakthrough point. It was operational art, perfected through the attrition of 4 years. From August 8th through November 11th, 1918, what historians would call the 100 Days Campaign, the Allies maintained constant pressure. Each operation was smaller than Amiens, but collectively they created an irresistible forward momentum. German reserves dwindled. Replacements arrived in smaller numbers. American production was supplying not just American forces, but also British and French formations. German industry, strangled by blockade and focused on survival rather than offensive production, couldn't match the flow of new equipment. Tank casualties mounted, but the Allies replaced them faster than the Germans could destroy them. The Mark V continued to prove its worth despite mechanical breakdowns. Medium A whippets provided rapid exploitation capability. By late August, German divisions facing British attacks began a new form of resistance: psychological collapse. Officers reported soldiers refusing to counterattack. Retreating troops shouted at reserves moving up to the front, "You're prolonging the war. and Black Leg. 5 German divisions had been effectively engulfed at Amiens. They ceased functioning as coherent military units. The confidence that sustained German soldiers for 4 years of impossible warfare had fractured. What the Germans needed was a dramatic defensive victory, proof that the line could still hold, that the sacrifices of 4 years meant something. The Hindenburg Line was supposed to provide that victory. In late August and early September, German forces fell back toward the fortifications, consolidating their remaining strength, preparing their last stand. By September 18, 1918, the Australian Corps attacked the forward outpost positions of the Hindenburg Line. Using only 8 tanks, plus dummy tanks designed to distract German attention, the Australians broke through the outpost defenses at a cost of 1,260 casualties. They captured 4,300 German prisoners, men who surrendered without significant resistance. The outpost line was supposed to be the first obstacle that would break up an attacking force. It wasn't supposed to collapse. German commanders realized the problem they faced. The Hindenburg Line was impregnable to conventional assault, to massed infantry attacks across broken terrain, but tanks weren't conventional assault forces. Tanks could cross trenches that would stop infantry. Tanks could absorb machine gun fire that would pin down attacking soldiers. Tanks could approach anti-tank obstacles slowly and methodically, and their attached sappers could clear mines or explosives. The Hindenburg mine's defenses, barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, machine gun emplacements, were designed to stop 1914 to 1918 warfare. They weren't designed to stop 1918 warfare. On September 29, 1918, the British Fourth Army and French First Army launched the decisive assault on the Hindenburg Line proper. Over 2,000 artillery pieces pounded the positions.
Then came the tanks. 342 Mark V and Mark V Star heavy tanks, 120 supply tanks, and 72 medium A Whippets. American forces, the 27th and 30th Divisions, attacked the tunnel defenses at Boney and Bellecourt under the command of Australian General John Monash. The British 46th Division, specially equipped with life jackets and portable bridging equipment, attacked north of Belenglis, preparing to cross the St. Quentin Canal.
The assault was comprehensive and relentless. By October 5, 1918, the Allies had broken through the entire depth of the Hindenburg Line over a 19-mile front. The fortification that German commanders had believed impregnable had fallen in less than a week of intensive fighting. General Henry Rawlinson of the British Fourth Army made a clinical observation. Had the Boche not shown marked signs of deterioration during the past month, I should never have contemplated attacking the Hindenburg Line. Had it been defended by the Germans of 2 years ago, it would certainly have been impregnable. It was the most accurate assessment of the entire campaign. The Hindenburg Line's collapse wasn't a failure of engineering or defensive preparation. It was a failure of the weapons system that had sustained German defense for 4 years. Trenches, barbed wire, machine guns, artillery, against a new technological and tactical combination. Coordinated tank assault with supporting artillery, air cover, and infantry. On October 8th, the Second Battle of Cambrai saw British First and Third Armies achieve breakthrough, with Canadian forces liberating the city itself. The collapse of the Hindenburg Line forced German High Command to admit what Ludendorff had known since August 8th. Germany had lost the war. On November 11, 1918, an armistice was signed. Guns fell silent. After 4 years and 95 days, the Great War was finished. November 11, 1918. 5 a.m., Compiègne Forest, France.
inside Marshal Ferdinand Foch's private railway car, parked in a secluded siding deep in the forest, German delegation head Matthias Erzenberger signed the armistice document with a pen that trembled, though whether from cold, exhaustion, or the weight of what he was committing to paper, no observer could say. The document itself was merciless. No negotiation, no compromise. The Allies handed the Germans a list of demands, gave them 72 hours to agree, and allowed only minor corrections, like removing impossible demands for submarines Germany didn't possess. The terms were clear: immediate cessation of hostilities on land, sea, and air, withdrawal of German forces west of the Rhine, Allied occupation of the Rhineland and bridgeheads further east, surrender of aircraft, warships, and military materiel, no release of German prisoners of war, continuation of the naval blockade that had starved Germany throughout the war. It was not a surrender negotiated between equals. It was a capitulation imposed by overwhelming force. But when Erzenberger raised his eyes from the document, he saw no triumph in Foch's expression. The Marshal was an old man who had watched millions die across 4 years of industrial slaughter. He was witnessing not victory, but the end of a nightmare that nobody knew how to stop. Foch appeared only twice during the 3 days of negotiations, once to ask what the Germans wanted, once to witness signatures. The actual discussions were conducted by subordinate officers who had grown mechanically efficient at discussing terms that Germany had no power to refuse. The armistice was to take effect at 11 a.m. Central European Time, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. At 10:20 a.m., Prime Minister David Lloyd George made an official announcement. The armistice was signed at 5 o'clock this morning, and hostilities are to cease on all fronts at 11 a.m. today. The news spread outward from headquarters like a wave traveling across the Western Front. At 10:50 a.m., Marshal Foch issued his final general order. Hostilities will cease on the whole front as from November 11th at 11 o'clock. The Allied troops will not, until further order, go beyond the line that reached on that date and at that hour. For most soldiers on the front line, men like Hans Müller, who had mocked the first tanks and survived to see the machines crush Germany's final fortification, the announcement came as an almost incomprehensible relief. A Battery C artilleryman named Robert Casey wrote in his journal, "And this is the end of it. In 3 hours the war will be over. It seems incredible even as I write it. I suppose I ought to be thrilled and cheering. Instead, I am merely apathetic and incredulous. There is some cheering across the river, occasional bursts of it as the news is carried to the advanced lines, but for the most part we are in silence. Withal is the feeling that it can't be true. For months we have slept under the guns. We cannot comprehend the stillness." The guns fell silent. At 11 a.m., the first peace gun was fired from Fort Mont Valérien near Paris. Bells rang across Paris. In London, crowds gathered in the streets, initially confused, then exploding into celebration as the reality penetrated consciousness. But on the front lines, the silence was suffocating. For 4 years, 95 days, and approximately 6 hours, the Western Front had been a place where industrial machinery killed men with mechanical precision, where artillery fired continuously, so continuously that soldiers who'd survived long enough developed auditory compensation, their brains learning not to register the constant barrage. Then, silence. In Berlin, the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, had abdicated on November 9th, reducing months of political turmoil to a single fact: The German monarchy was finished. A new government, headed by Friedrich Ebert, scrambled to negotiate terms, knowing that refusal would result in invasion by allies now moving across France toward the Rhine. The mathematics had become impossible to dispute. Germany had entered 1918 with 20 tanks. The Allies had destroyed that advantage through technological evolution, deployed hundreds of machines, and broken the Hindenburg line. But it was more than tanks. It was tanks plus artillery, plus air superiority, plus manpower reserves, plus industrial production, plus the will to continue fighting when victory seemed impossible. It was the combination of all these factors, applied simultaneously across 400 miles of front, with such overwhelming momentum that no defense could hold. The trench warfare system, the technological and tactical framework that had defined the Western Front since 1914, was obsolete. Not because tanks alone were invincible. Early tanks were slow, vulnerable, mechanically unreliable, but combined with artillery, they could achieve breakthrough. Coordinated with air power, they could maintain momentum. Supported by fresh reserves and unlimited ammunition, they could break fortifications that conventional assault troops couldn't penetrate. The Hindenburg line, that impregnable fortress that German commanders had believed would be their salvation, fell in less than a week of tank-supported assault. What the German soldiers had laughed at in 1916, that slow iron coffin that they'd mocked and misunderstood, had become the instrument of their defeat. Except, it wasn't really the tanks, was it? It was what the tanks represented. It was the end of an era. The age of cavalry, of maneuver warfare in open terrain, had ended in 1914 when rifled machine guns mowed down mounted soldiers by the thousands. The age of trench warfare, the stalemate that killed millions without achieving breakthrough, had ended in 1918 when tanks proved that trenches could be crossed, that defenses could be overcome. A new age was beginning. An age where armor, mobility, and coordinated firepower would define warfare. Hans Müller, somewhere in the German rear, laid down his rifle for the last time. He'd survived from September 15, 1916, that day when the first tanks appeared, through to November 11, 1918. He'd mocked the machines. He'd fought against them. He'd watched them evolve from unreliable, limited production curiosities into overwhelming force. The guns had fallen silent, but the age of tanks, the age the first Mark I had introduced 2 years earlier, was just beginning.